and welcome to the 2017 video topic analysis for the Tournament of Champions. Champion Briefs Institute would like to congratulate everyone that's going to the tournament and really congratulate you for the years of hard work that goes into qualifying for such a prestigious activity. So we had an original topic analysis for the January-February topic, the one that they'll be using at the TOC, and a lot of you had a lot of questions in regards to the T-shell that we discussed, this whole idea of regulations versus restrictions. So we decided we'd do an additional video that just goes through how you would construct the T-shell like that. So we'll start by going through just a little bit of the structures and then some various comments at the end. So the first thing when you want to do when constructing a T-shell is have a really strong interpretation at the top, right? That's just generally the top of a T-shell. I find that if you have multiple definitions, it's generally best to have a sentence interpretation at the top and then keep your definitions underneath it so that it's clear to the judge how you're using each of the cards in tandem to determine what is required of the affirmative. Other than that, an interpretation, really all you want is good specific evidence that's in the context of the topic. Now generally that's not the easiest thing in the world to find. A lot of T-interps that you find are really going to be from some old generic court cases. They might not even be from the United States. And so in those instances, you're really going to have to rely on the strength of your standards to justify your interpretation. But the interpretations I've provided for you today are CSAO in 94, where they argue that the court held the word restrict referred only to outright prohibitions, and consequence does not equal a prohibition. And then P.N. Shimgal in 1979 argued that a distinction between regulation and restriction or prohibition has always been drawn. And then Sinha in 2006 mirrored the exact same definition. So I know last time there was a lot of problem with some individuals finding these interpretations when I just said them. So I've attached a citation document that has the URLs so that you can access all of these interpretations on your own. I've even put in the text so you can see exactly which sentences I drew them from. But the point is, all these interpretations seems to draw a very clear distinction between the word restrict and regulate. And that's not really an arbitrary distinction. That distinction has meaning. Actually, last year at the National Forensics Association National Tournament, this is what the final round was about, like this distinction between the two words, because restrict is often defined as just being a prohibition. And that is defined as distinct from regulation, which in a lot of ways promotes the freedom or faculty to which something is being regulated, right? So it allows elements of both directions to the topic, right? So to be clear, a restriction means a prohibition. A regulation means putting conditions on something that may or may not increase the likelihood of that activity happening, right? And so the may or may not increase element is where you get a lot of your abuse from this interpretation, right? So in a T-shell, you've got your interpretation, violations, reasons to prefer, and then voters, right? So we've done the interpretation. Now you move on to the violation, right? So with a strong violation, you want to clearly articulate what the affirmative has done that is inconsistent with the interpretation you've justified. So here we've made the articulation that restrict must mean an outright prohibition, right? That would be our interpretation. And so the violation would make arguments about how, for example, the affirmative makes arguments about safe spaces being problematic. We would say that's not a topical discussion because safe spaces don't outright prohibit speech. They regulate where speech can happen. And that distinction allows the affirmative to sidestep issues of full-on bans on public speaking, right? And so that would be your violation. You articulate what the affirmative has done and why that's inconsistent with your interpretation. And then the next part of a T-shell is the standards, or the reasons to prefer your interpretation. Now, I think over the past several years, I've judged a lot of rounds, and to me, this is the part that most debaters mess up on, is the standards debate, right? It's important to note that standards are not voting issues. Standards are reasons to prefer an interpretation and should be thought of more like every other part of the dissad, right? They should be thought of as advantages and disadvantages to various interpretations, right? That's all they are. So I find a lot of people putting random like impact or voting issues in standards, or talking about their affirmative a lot in standards, and I don't think that's really getting to the meat of the issue, right? The issue is why your interpretation is good or bad or better than the others, and that's all really standards are. And as a whole, I think there's about 3 main types of standards you'll run into when writing or debating T-shells. The first type of standard is evidence quality, right? So these are standards that relate to the specific card that you've read in the round as an interpretation, right? So these are things like intent to define, right? That your interpretation has an intention to define the word. It's not just being used passively, and as a result, that should be preferred over a word that just or an interpretation that just happens to include the element of the word, right? Another one here might be legal definitions best, or field context, right? Like your interpretation comes specifically from authors in relation to the resolution, right? Another one might be international consensus if you're using like United Nations interpretations or court cases that are referencing other court cases. It could include dictionary definitions best. That's like a pretty common one you hear as a result of predictability, right? But in essence, this group of standards generally emphasizes why your card is better than the other person's card. But that's a little bit shallow when it comes to T-debate. The next type of standard that you'll run into is justification standards. And to me, I find these to be generally the most persuasive. And these are arguments that discuss what your interpretation justifies, right? And I find these really persuasive because these are things like ground, right? The idea that your interpretation gives the affirmative extra ground and allows them to circumvent neg offense, right? That's not really a question of what the affirmative does, right? That's a question of what allowing the affirmative as a topical or as part of the topic justifies for the rest of the topic and for the rest of debate, right? Another example of this could be bidirectionality, right? Like allowing safe spaces to be used as a topical affirmative allows the affirmative to sidestep the issues of free speech good, bad, and instead they can focus on elements of how perhaps like safe space zones might increase in the long-term free speech or whatever, you know? But the idea is that when you don't force someone to outright ban something, it allows them to have shades of gray on the desirability of the subject of the resolution. Another thing that you could have for justification standards is like effects topicality, right? Allowing an affirmative that can engage in regulations means that they can effectually meet the interpretation of the resolution, right? Like, even if we can prove as the negative in a vacuum that restrictions on public speaking are good, right? Like when you're not viewing that in a vacuum, it does things like mixes burdens, right? It leads to pre-fiat arguments being included in the debate, right? It leads to speculative solvency, right? It leads to unlimiting affirmatives where you could, for example, you can't raise tuition because it might limit students' access to opportunities for free speech, right? Or it might increase advantage ground for the affirmative. But regardless, these justification standards are just arguments that show what allowing the affirmative or things like the affirmative would do to the overall scope of the topic. And then the last group of standards that I'd like to focus on is precision standards, right? So these are just arguments that focus on how specific your interpretation might be to the resolution. So these are things like framers' intent, right? The people who designed the resolution, this is what they meant, and so that's why my interpretation is best. Another example here would be grammar, right? When you're including multiple words of the like this isn't particularly relevant to this T-shell, right? But grammar could be used when you're including multiple elements or multiple words from the resolution to prove that their interpretation was myopic and didn't take into account what the larger context of the resolution means for the whole sentence, right? And so that's basically what you get into with standards, right? Reasons why your interpretation is better. And then you get down to voters, right? So in NFA LD, the college version of LD, topicality is just in the rules as a voting issue, so we often don't have to justify why it is a voting issue. But in high school and in LD, there's not really, or in high school LD and policy, there's not really any specific rules about T, so it's up to the debaters to justify why framing the topic in a certain way is a voting issue. So some examples of that could be things like jurisdiction, right? The judge doesn't have the jurisdiction to vote on something that's outside the resolution. But personally, I think the most persuasive is just resolutional sufficiency. If the affirmative is not an example of the resolution, logical decision-making dictates that the judge would not vote for them because all the resolution is a question, or like all the ballot is a question of if the resolution should or should not pass. And so if they're not an example of it, you would default negative because nobody in the round has proved that the resolution should pass. Another really common one is competitive equity, right? People will try to frame the standards as voting issues and say, the way you have skewed me out of ground should be a voting issue. That's certainly isn't a necessarily true argument, but it is a way of impacting out your T-shell. Another one could be topic education. Perhaps them sidestepping it distracts from issues that are relevant to society. But in any event, you're going to want to try to shape why reading of this shell and reading of this argument or them violating this argument is a reason to reject them as a debater. I think another wise thing to do in the voters, especially in high school LD, where the time trade-off between the NC and the AR is 3 minutes, I think as the negative constructive, it's a good idea to preempt reasonability, right? So reasonability is the idea that the affirmative should only have to meet a interpretation of the resolution, not the best interpretation of the resolution, because there are competing interpretations in the literature base, and forcing the judge to evaluate them increases judge intervention or creates a race to the bottom, right? There's all kinds of justifications for voting for any interpretation of the resolution rather than the best. But that's time that the affirmative has to invest in the AR making those arguments. And so I think if you want to be a competitive debater from the negative perspective, manipulating time is really important. And so from a negative constructive perspective, if you're preempting reasonability by saying competing interpretations is good for depth or clash, or to avoid judge intervention, in your negative constructive shell, you have put a massive time pressure on the affirmative rebuttal, and they'll have a hard time answering T, at least thoroughly, and so it increases your chances of going for it successfully, right? So today we've gone through what a T shell looks like. You've got your interpretation, violation, standards, and impact. It's just like any other type of argument. The link is the thing you really want to start with, and the link on a T-shell is a violation, right? The most important argument is why the affirmative doesn't meet your interpretation. But from there, it's really important that the rest of the shell follows these types of formulas. They don't have to be exactly formatted like this. Some people have more simplistic voters. Some people's voters are mixed in with their standards, right? There's certainly various ways to do it. But it's important that you have all of these elements in a T-shell to be extremely successful. If you have any questions, please, again, leave them in the comments. I've made these citations available. I hope that helps. Other than that, have a great day.